Hey, Jack Ryan here with another session of the Legal and Liability Risk Management Institute's various segments on use of force and legal issues involving use of force. I want to talk to you today about probably the most important case, in fact by far the most important case that come out of the Supreme Court on use of force. And I don't want to talk about all the facts of the case. That'll be left for a longer segment, and we've covered that in longer segments. But I really want to talk about how to utilize Graham versus Connor, the Supreme Court case that instructs courts, instructs juries how to analyze use of force. As such, it ought to also instruct us on how to make use of force decisions, because if we act consistently with Graham, then we act consistently with the Constitution. Graham basically decided that all use of force, particularly in the road operation, on the street, will be judged by Fourth Amendment standards, and all use of force has to be objectively reasonable, taking into account the totality of circumstances that the officer faced at the time the force was used. So that's kind of the legal overview. The court then said, look, here's how you decide if an officer's actions were objectively reasonable. You'll look at three things. How serious was the offense the officer suspected at the time the force was used? Because remember, we get to use force to apprehend people. See, private security doesn't get to do that. The citizen doesn't get to do that. But we get to use force to apprehend people. So this is important. How serious was the offense? So think about this for a second. Let's suppose that we get called to a shoplifter who's fleeing from, I don't know, Target. And we get there and we see the shoplifter running across the parking lot with the security officer chasing him. How much force can we use to apprehend that shoplifter? Let's change it. Let's suppose we get called to a rape in progress and they're calling for a rescue. And in fact, some reliable person is on the scene and says, my God, I don't think this person's going to make it. And we pull up and they point out the suspect to us in that one and say, that's him. In fact, let's make it crazy. He's covered in blood. How much force can we use to apprehend that guy? Is that serious rape, but maybe a murder, more serious than the shoplifter? So that's step one. Step two, what's the physical threat that this person poses to either us or somebody else? Now, even in this escape situation that I've just laid out, we'll change it in a second, but even in this escape situation, think about this. If the person who shoplifted is able to escape, how serious is that? Versus if this rapist murderer is allowed to escape, how serious is that? What's the physical threat? In other words, take the crime out of it for a minute, but if a shoplifter escapes, the future threat is probably that he's going to shoplift again. Or maybe not because he almost got caught. In the case of the rapist murderer, chances are that they may rape and murder again. So again, that physical threat also plays into the seriousness of offense. Those two kind of commingle together, right? There can be other cases. Let's suppose that, I don't know, we've got a little old lady who we're trying to arrest, or maybe she's in the midst of doing something that's criminal in nature, and hell, she won't comply with our commands to step out of the car. It's a suspended license violation. She won't get out of the car. What physical threat does this 97-pound little old lady pose to us? Oh, and by the way, don't fight the hypothetical. We've got the keys out of the car and the car's off, so there's no chance she's going to drive the car at us or anybody else. How much of a threat does she pose? Let's change it. We've got the same offense, suspended license, but now we tell this 6'8", 300-pound, chiseled like, steel subject who says the same thing. We say, get out of the car, and he says, you better get some help. How much of a threat do they pose? So again, the level of threat may change. Availability of weapons, for example. If somebody's got a weapon available, that changes the assessment of threat. So the greater the threat, the more force we can use. Same thing. Same thing with active resistance to arrest. So for example, let's suppose that the active resistance to arrest is just sitting down on the ground and crying. Well, that's one thing. What if the active resistance changes? It's pushing away from us. That's one thing. What if the act of resistance to arrest is punching us in the face? See? So there's levels of active resistance that are going to justify greater degrees of force. And I think in my first instance, where the guy sitting on the ground is passive resistance. But if we take our two levels of active resistance that I identified, pushing off versus punching us in the face versus pulling a gun and saying, I'm not going with you, those are three different levels of active resistance. And the greater the active resistance, the more force can be used to overcome. Evade arrest by flight's easy. If they're evading arrest by flight on foot, that's one level of force. If they're evading arrest by flight by fleeing in a vehicle and posing a threat to others, that may be another level of force. Bottom line is, the three-part test is what really dictates what force will be reasonable in a given circumstance. So, again, the grand three-part test. How serious is the offense? What's the physical threat to the officer or others at the time the force is used? And is the subject actively resisting or attempting to evade arrest by flight? And what are the levels of each of those? I think it's important to point out that the test is really, really easy. And I think this is consistent with all of the Fourth Amendment. One of the ways an officer can easily decide what level of power they have in a given situation is to ask this simple question: how important is this? How important is this? Because the greater the degree of importance to government interest, the more power an officer has. So again, let's look at it this way. If we're trying to protect our borders and national security, there's things that Border Patrol can do and our national security folks can do, our Homeland Security folks can do, that the law enforcement officer on the street can never do. And yet, they can legally do it where the guy on the street can't do it, because the government interest is going up. As the government interest goes up, so does government power. And that's really what Graham is all about. The government interest in more serious crime is higher than the shoplifter. Murder is higher than the shoplifter. The physical threat, the person pushing off us and just trying to get away, is different than the person that physically attacks or attacks with a weapon and tries to get away. Government interest goes up. Same thing with active resistance. The heightened degree of active resistance, the greater the government interest. So again, we look at these things, and I think the easy way to explain it sometimes is, how important is this? As you go through training, for example, if you are going through one of our simulators right now, and that's what we're doing today, and you're going to watch this video as part of going through simulation training, what I want you to do is, after the scenario, I want you to think about, all right, how serious was the offense I suspected at the time I used whatever force it was I used? What was the physical threat to me or anybody else present in the scenario? And was the subject actively resisting or attempting to evade arrest by flight? And then try to, articulate why you took the action you did in terms of that three-part test. Because that's how your actions will be reviewed if the lawsuit comes. Hey, thank you for joining us today, and be safe and have a great day.